The summer had just begun, and the city was already sweltering under an oppressive heat wave. Sarah, Megan, Luke, and Jake were bored out of their minds, scrolling aimlessly through their phones at Jake's place, looking for something, anything, to do. That's when Jake's cousin texted him about a strange forest just outside of town, a place that the locals refused to enter. He sent a link to an article about people who went missing there, claiming the forest was alive and evil. Jake chuckled as he read it out loud to the group, but the mention of disappearances piqued their curiosity. "Let's go check it out," Luke suggested, a grin spreading across his face. "I mean, we're not gonna let some ghost story scare us, right?" The others hesitated for a moment but soon agreed. They were tired of the same old routine, and a little adventure sounded perfect. They packed some snacks, flashlights, and a first aid kit, just in case, and piled into Megan's car, heading out of the city towards the rumored haunted forest. The drive was filled with laughter and the excitement of doing something out of the ordinary. But as they neared the forest, a sense of unease settled in the car. The trees seemed unnaturally dense, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine, but she shrugged it off as just nerves. "It's just a forest," she told herself, "nothing more." They parked at the edge of the woods, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon. As they stepped out, an uncanny silence greeted them, no birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. Jake led the way, pushing through the underbrush, his bravado masking the growing knot of anxiety in his stomach. Each step deeper into the forest felt like stepping into another world, a world where the rules they knew no longer applied. Minutes turned into hours as they wandered deeper, the forest growing darker and more oppressive with every step. Shadows danced at the edge of their vision, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. Megan, who had been skeptical from the start, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She kept glancing over her shoulder, convinced that something was lurking just out of sight. "Guys," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of their footsteps, "do you feel that? Like, we're not alone here?" The group paused, exchanging uneasy glances. The thrill of adventure was starting to wear thin, replaced by a gnawing dread that settled deep in their bones. But turning back now felt like admitting defeat, and none of them were willing to be the first to suggest it. "It's just your imagination," Luke said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Come on, let's keep going. We're probably just scaring ourselves." The deeper they ventured into the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees, once ordinary, now seemed to lean in closer, their twisted branches forming unnatural shapes against the darkening sky. A mist began to roll in, swirling around their ankles like ghostly fingers, and a strange smell hung in the air, a mix of damp earth and something metallic, almost like blood. Sarah tried to keep her breathing steady, but every breath felt like inhaling fear itself. As they continued, Jake noticed something odd about the trees. "Hey, does anyone else see that?" he asked, pointing to the bark of a nearby tree. The others gathered around to look. Carved into the trunk were symbols, strange, indecipherable markings that didn't look like any language they'd ever seen. They were crude but deliberate, and they gave off a faint, almost imperceptible glow. "What the hell is that?" Megan whispered, reaching out to touch the carvings, but Jake pulled her hand back. "Don't," he warned. "We don't know what that is. It could be, I don't know, something bad." The group exchanged nervous glances. The idea of turning back was becoming more appealing, but something about the forest seemed to draw them in, as if it had already decided they were not leaving. Not long after, the whispers began. At first, they were so faint that Sarah thought it was just the wind, but then they grew louder, distinct, and chilling. The voices seemed to come from all around them, whispering their names, taunting them with secrets only they knew. Jake, Sarah, Megan, Luke. The voices echoed in a dissonant chorus. Luke spun around, flashlight beam darting through the dark, but there was no one there, only the endless stretch of trees. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice shaking. The others nodded, fear now evident on their faces. "Okay, this is getting really freaky," Megan muttered, her earlier skepticism fading fast. She was about to suggest they head back when she tripped over something on the ground. "Ouch!" she yelped, catching herself before she fell. "What is it?" Sarah asked, shining her flashlight down. In the beam of light, they saw what Megan had tripped over, an old, weathered journal, its pages yellowed and frayed. Megan picked it up, hesitating for a moment before opening it. The first few pages were blank, but as she flipped through, she found entries. Entries describing the exact same feeling of being watched, the strange whispers, and the symbols on the trees. The last entry was hastily written, the words almost incoherent with fear. "It knows. It's coming for me. The forest. It's alive." A cold chill ran through them all as they read the words. "This is insane," Jake said, but even he couldn't hide the fear in his voice. "What does it mean, the forest is alive?" Megan shook her head, closing the journal. "I don't know, but I don't think we should stick around to find out." Just as they turned to leave, the ground beneath them shifted, almost like it was breathing. Roots burst from the earth, wrapping around their ankles, pulling them towards the trees. Panic set in as they tried to free themselves, but the roots tightened their grip, pulling them closer to the forest floor. Sarah screamed as she saw something move in the darkness, a shadow, impossibly tall and twisted, lurking just beyond the tree line. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling their heads with a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate and terrified than the last. "Run!" Jake shouted, managing to pull free and grab Megan's hand. The group broke into a frantic sprint, the forest seeming to close in around them, branches reaching out like skeletal hands trying to pull them back. They could hear the ground shifting beneath them, like the forest itself was alive, hunting them. Every step felt like they were sinking deeper into some dark, twisted nightmare. But no matter how fast they ran, the whispers followed, growing louder and more frantic. The trees seemed to stretch and bend, their bark twisting into grotesque faces, mouths open in silent screams. The path that they thought they were following disappeared, leaving them surrounded by a sea of black, gnarled trunks and roots that writhed like snakes. "We're lost," Luke gasped, stopping to catch his breath. "We're lost, and it's playing with us." Megan clutched the journal tightly to her chest, her mind racing. "The journal," she said, flipping it open again. "Maybe there's something in here. Something we missed." The group huddled together, desperately scanning the pages as the forest continued to close in around them. "Wait," Sarah said, pointing to a passage they had overlooked. "It says here that there's a clearing. Somewhere deep in the forest. It might be our only chance to find a way out." They had no choice but to press on, their only light the weak beams from their flashlights, cutting through the oppressive darkness. But the deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to resist, pushing back against them with every step. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the air grew colder, thicker, almost like it was trying to suffocate them. They could feel the forest's hunger, a deep, primal need that gnawed at their very souls. As they trudged forward, they could feel themselves being watched, not just by the forest, but by something far older, something that had been waiting for them. And they knew, with a chilling certainty, that it would not let them leave. As they pushed deeper into the forest, the sense of dread grew stronger, pressing against their chests like a weight. Each breath felt like inhaling ice, and every sound, no matter how small, seemed magnified in the eerie stillness. The whispers had faded, but the silence that replaced them was even more unnerving. It was the kind of silence that promised something terrible was about to happen. Luke, leading the way, tried to keep his footing steady, but the ground beneath him felt unstable, like it could give way at any moment. Without warning, the forest erupted into chaos. The trees groaned and twisted, their branches reaching out like claws. Vines snaked around their feet, pulling them in different directions. Luke was yanked off his feet, dragged screaming into the darkness before anyone could react. "Luke!" Sarah screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the forest, the shadows closing in around him. Panic set in as they tried to chase after him, but the forest seemed to move against them. Every step forward felt like wading through quicksand, the ground shifting and pulling them back. Megan was the first to notice the strange figures moving among the trees. At first, she thought it was Luke, but as they got closer, she realized they weren't human. They were twisted shapes, half-formed bodies that seemed to blend with the bark and leaves, their faces contorted in silent screams. "We need to get out of here," Jake yelled, but it was impossible to tell which way was out. The forest had shifted around them, twisting the path into a labyrinth of shadows and thorns. Every turn led them deeper into the woods, further away from any hope of escape. The trees seemed to close in, the branches overhead forming a dark canopy that blocked out the sky. As they stumbled forward, they heard Luke's voice, faint and distorted, echoing through the trees. "Help me. Please." But when they tried to follow the sound, it seemed to come from all directions at once, twisting through the air like a cruel trick. The forest was playing with them, toying with their minds and their fears. They found a small clearing, the ground littered with bones, some animal, others unmistakably human. At the center of the clearing was an old stone altar, covered in moss and strange carvings similar to the ones they had seen on the trees. "What is this place?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. The air around the altar was cold, unnaturally so, and a thick mist hung low to the ground, swirling in unnatural patterns. Jake stepped closer to the altar, curiosity getting the better of him. "It's like some kind of shrine," he muttered, running his hand over the stone. As his fingers traced the carvings, a sudden gust of wind blew through the clearing, carrying with it a faint, ghostly wail. The trees around them seemed to shudder, and the mist began to thicken, rising up like a living thing. Suddenly, Megan screamed. She stumbled back, pointing to something behind the altar. The others turned to see what had terrified her, and their blood ran cold. There, half buried in the underbrush, was Luke, or what was left of him. His body was twisted and broken, his face frozen in a mask of terror. Deep cuts ran across his skin, forming the same strange symbols they had seen on the trees. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly into the sky, but there was no life in them, only an empty, soulless void. "Oh God!" Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We have to get out of here. We have to," but before she could finish, the ground beneath them trembled, and the altar began to glow with a faint, eerie light. The symbols carved into its surface pulsed like a heartbeat, and a low, rumbling sound filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. The forest seemed to come alive, the trees swaying and groaning as if in pain. The air grew colder, and a dense fog rolled in, obscuring their vision. They could hear something moving in the mist, heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, like something massive was making its way toward them. "What the hell is that?" Jake whispered, backing away from the altar. The answer came in the form of a low, guttural growl that seemed to resonate through the ground beneath their feet. Out of the mist emerged a figure, a monstrous creature made of twisted branches, roots, and earth, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It stood over 10 feet tall, its body a grotesque amalgamation of the forest itself. As it moved, the trees seemed to bend toward it, almost as if they were bowing to some dark, ancient deity. "We need to run." Megan screamed, but her legs felt like lead, her body refusing to obey. The creature took a step closer, its form shifting and changing with each movement, as if it were a part of the forest itself. Its eyes locked onto Megan, and she felt a cold dread settle in her bones. The whispers returned, louder now, filling her mind with a chorus of voices, some pleading, some angry, all desperate. "Give yourself to the forest," the voices chanted in unison. "Become one with us." Jake grabbed Megan's arm, pulling her back. "We have to go now," he shouted, but the creature was faster. It lashed out with a massive arm made of branches, striking Jake and sending him crashing into a tree. He slumped to the ground, unconscious or worse. The creature loomed over him, its eyes glowing brighter, and the forest seemed to pulse with anticipation, like it was waiting for something. Sarah and Megan, fueled by a surge of adrenaline, turned and ran, their footsteps echoing through the trees. The creature let out a roar, a sound that shook the very ground, and began to give chase. The forest closed in around them, branches clawing at their clothes, roots tripping them up, but they kept moving, driven by sheer terror. They could hear the creature behind them, its footsteps heavy and relentless, gaining on them with every second. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, filling their minds with fear and confusion. They stumbled through the darkness, unable to see more than a few feet ahead, but they knew they had to keep moving, had to find a way out. But no matter how fast they ran, it felt like they were being pulled deeper into the forest's grasp. The ground beneath them seemed to shift and move, and the trees bent and twisted as if they were alive, reaching out to ensnare them. Every breath was a struggle, the air thick with the scent of decay and earth, and their hearts pounded in their chests, each beat a desperate plea for escape. The forest was alive, and it was hungry. Megan and Sarah stumbled through the darkness, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed to pulse with a malevolent life, its branches reaching out like skeletal fingers to snag at their clothes and skin. Every step felt like a struggle against some unseen force pulling them back, deeper into the darkness. The creature's growls echoed behind them, each one closer than the last, sending fresh waves of panic coursing through their veins. They could hardly see through the dense fog that had settled over the forest, reducing visibility to mere feet ahead. The forest floor was uneven and treacherous, roots and rocks hidden beneath the thick underbrush threatening to trip them with every step. Megan stumbled, her foot catching on a root, and she went down hard, the wind knocked out of her lungs. "Megan!" Sarah cried, grabbing her friend's arm and hauling her back to her feet. "We have to keep moving. I can't do this." Megan gasped, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the dirt and blood from a cut on her forehead. But Sarah wasn't listening. She knew if they stopped, even for a second, they were as good as dead. She gripped Megan's hand tighter and pulled her forward, every instinct screaming at her to run, to keep moving, to survive. They burst into another small clearing, and for a moment, everything was deathly still. The fog seemed to lift slightly, revealing the full moon overhead, casting an eerie glow over the scene. In the center of the clearing was an old, crumbling stone well, its sides covered in moss and strange carvings similar to those they had seen on the trees and the altar. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, swirling around them in a cacophony of voices. The well. Megan whispered, staring at it with wide, terrified eyes. The journal. It mentioned a well. Sarah fumbled for the journal in her backpack, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold onto it. She flipped through the pages, desperately searching for any clue, any way to escape this nightmare. Here, she said, pointing to a passage. It says the well is a gateway. A way out of the forest. But it requires a sacrifice. The word hung in the air between them like a death sentence. A sacrifice. It didn't say what kind, but the implication was clear. They looked at each other, fear mirrored in their eyes, but there was no time to discuss it. The creature's growl rumbled through the trees, closer now, and they knew it would be upon them any second. Megan's mind raced. Maybe it doesn't have to be one of us, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Maybe it can be something else. Something alive. Sarah nodded, grabbing the flashlight from her pack. She shone it around the clearing, desperately searching for anything that might help them. Her eyes landed on a small, frightened rabbit caught in the underbrush, its eyes wide with terror. Without thinking, she lunged forward, grabbing the rabbit. It squirmed in her hands, but she held tight, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she carried the rabbit to the edge of the well. Megan was right behind her, clutching the journal to her chest, whispering a desperate prayer under her breath. They could hear the creature now, crashing through the trees, its growls echoing through the night. They were out of time. With a final, desperate cry, Sarah threw the rabbit into the well, the small creature disappearing into the darkness below. For a moment, nothing happened. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation. Then, slowly, the ground beneath their feet began to shake. The carvings on the well stones glowed with a faint, eerie light, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. The fog swirled around them, thick and cold, and they felt a pull, a force dragging them toward the well. "Hold on!" Megan screamed, grabbing Sarah's arm. "Don't let go!" But the force was too strong. They felt themselves being pulled toward the well, their feet sliding across the ground, the fog wrapping around them like a shroud. They could hear the creature's growl, closer now, so close they could feel its breath on their necks. Panic set in, and they clung to each other, desperately trying to resist the pull. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light, and the force pulling them stopped. The fog lifted, and they found themselves standing on the edge of the clearing, the well behind them. The forest was silent, the whispers gone. The creature was nowhere to be seen. They looked around, dazed and confused, their hearts still racing. What just happened? Megan asked, her voice shaking. Sarah shook her head, unable to find the words. The journal had fallen to the ground, its pages fluttering in the breeze. She picked it up, her eyes scanning the last entry. It didn't make any sense. The well was supposed to be a gateway, a way out. But they were still here, still trapped in the forest. Before they could think any further, a low, rumbling sound filled the air. The ground beneath them began to shake again, more violently this time. The trees around them groaned and twisted, their branches reaching out like claws. The fog returned, thicker than before, and they could hear the creatures growl, louder, more menacing. "We need to move," Sarah said, grabbing Megan's hand. "Now!" They turned and ran, the forest seeming to close in around them, the ground shifting beneath their feet. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, filling their minds with fear and confusion. The forest was alive, and it wasn't going to let them go so easily. They ran for what felt like hours, their lungs burning, their legs aching. The forest seemed endless, a maze of shadows and thorns. Every path they took seemed to lead them deeper into its heart, further away from any hope of escape. They were exhausted, their bodies screaming for rest, but they knew if they stopped, they were as good as dead. Finally, they stumbled upon another clearing, this one smaller, more enclosed. In the center was a circle of stones, each one covered in strange symbols, similar to the ones they had seen on the altar and the well. The air was cold, and the ground was littered with bones, some animal, others unmistakably human. They had no idea where they were, but one thing was certain, they were not safe. Megan collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "We're never getting out of here, are we?" she sobbed, her voice barely more than a whisper. Sarah knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around her friend. "We can't give up," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "There has to be a way out. There has to be." As they sat there, catching their breath, they heard a noise, soft at first, but growing louder. It was a voice, a child's voice, singing a lullaby. They looked at each other, fear etched on their faces. "Who? Who is that?" Megan whispered. The singing grew louder, and they could see a figure emerging from the shadows, a young girl, no more than 8 or 9, her hair long and matted, her eyes wide and vacant. The girl continued to sing, her voice haunting and sweet, as she approached them. They wanted to run, but their bodies refused to move, frozen in place by some unseen force. The girl stopped a few feet away, her head tilted to one side, her eyes locked onto theirs. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice soft and eerie. "The forest doesn't like strangers." Megan and Sarah exchanged a terrified glance, unsure of what to do. The girl took a step closer, her expression unchanged. "If you want to leave, you have to give it something. Something it wants." She pointed to the circle of stones. "A life for a life. That's the only way." The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. The forest required a sacrifice, a human sacrifice. And they had nothing left to give but themselves. Megan and Sarah stared at the girl, the weight of her words sinking in like stones. The forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows deepening, the air growing colder. They both knew what needed to be done, but neither wanted to say it. "We can't," Sarah finally whispered, her voice cracking. "There has to be another way. There has to be." The girl's expression didn't change. She just stood there, staring with those empty eyes, and repeated, "A life for a life. That's the only way." Her voice was soft but firm, like a death sentence whispered in the dark. Megan's mind was racing, searching for any possible solution, but she kept coming back to the same grim conclusion. "We're not going to make it out of here, are we?" Megan asked, her voice barely audible. Sarah looked at her friend, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't know, she admitted. But I'm not ready to give up. The air around them grew colder, the fog thicker, as if the forest itself was waiting for their decision. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to tremble, a low, ominous rumble that grew louder with each passing second. The trees around them swayed, their branches creaking and groaning like ancient bones. The girl vanished into the mist, her voice echoing softly, "A life for a life." The creature's growl rumbled through the forest, closer now, more menacing. The ground split open near the circle of stones, and from it, roots and vines emerged, twisting and writhing like serpents. The creature stepped into the clearing, its monstrous form towering over them. Its eyes burned with a malevolent light, and its body seemed to pulse with the very life of the forest. It took a step toward them, its massive limbs cracking and creaking, and the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling their minds with dread. Megan took a deep breath, a sudden resolve hardening her features. "I'll do it," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "I'll be the sacrifice." Sarah turned to her, shaking her head furiously. "No, Megan. We can find another way. We just need more time." Megan shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "There is no other way, Sarah. You know that. This thing isn't going to stop until it gets what it wants." Before Sarah could protest further, Megan stepped into the circle of stones. The ground beneath her feet felt cold and hard, the air thick with anticipation. The creature stopped, its eyes fixed on her, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her in a cacophony of voices, some pleading, some angry, all desperate. "I'm sorry," Megan whispered, looking at Sarah one last time. "I'm sorry it has to be this way." She closed her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest, and waited for the end. The creature took another step toward her, its massive form looming over the circle, and the ground began to shake violently. The vines and roots surged forward, wrapping around Megan's legs, pulling her down. "No!" Sarah screamed, rushing forward, but it was too late. The vines tightened their grip, dragging Megan into the earth, her screams echoing through the night. The ground swallowed her up, the stones glowing with a faint, eerie light. The forest seemed to sigh, a long, low exhale, and the whispers faded into silence. For a moment, everything was still. The fog lifted, revealing the full moon overhead, casting a cold, silver light over the clearing. The creature stared at Sarah, its eyes no longer burning with anger, but with something else, satisfaction. Then, slowly, it began to dissolve into the mist, its form breaking apart like smoke on the wind. The ground stopped shaking, the trees ceased their groaning, and the forest fell silent once more. Sarah fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with sobs. Megan was gone, taken by the forest, sacrificed to whatever dark force lurked within these woods. She clutched the journal to her chest, her mind numb with grief and horror. She had lost her best friend, and now she was alone, trapped in a nightmare with no way out. But as she sat there, she noticed something, a faint light, just beyond the trees. She stood up, wiping the tears from her eyes, and moved toward it, hope flickering in her heart. The light grew brighter as she approached, and she realized it was a path, leading out of the forest. The journal had been right, a sacrifice had been needed, but now, the forest was letting her go. She hesitated for a moment, looking back at the circle of stones where Megan had disappeared. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, her voice breaking. "I'll never forget you." Then, taking a deep breath, she stepped onto the path and began to walk. The light grew brighter, the fog lifting, and she could feel the oppressive weight of the forest lifting from her shoulders. With each step, the whispers grew fainter, the shadows receding, until finally, she broke through the tree line and into the open air. She stumbled forward, falling to her knees on the cool grass, the night sky stretching out above her. The forest was behind her now, silent and still, its dark secrets hidden once more. She had made it out. She was free. But as she sat there, catching her breath, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She glanced back at the forest, its twisted branches silhouetted against the moonlit sky, and for a moment, she thought she saw something, a figure, standing just beyond the trees, watching her with glowing eyes. A shiver ran down her spine, and she turned away, forcing herself to stand. She needed to get away, to put as much distance between herself and the forest as possible. She took one last look at the dark, silent woods, then turned and walked away, the whispers still echoing faintly in her mind. The forest was alive, and it would always be waiting.